Hola, buenos días, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a este seminario sobre constitucionalismo progresista. Queremos, a cargo del profesor Mark Tushnet, queremos agradecerle que haya aceptado la invitación. El profesor Tushnet es profesor de la Universidad de Harvard, de su Escuela de Derecho, un muy reconocido constitucionalista en el mundo, tanto especialista en Derecho Constitucional norteamericano como en Derecho Constitucional comparado. Comentarles a quienes nos ven y sintonizan este seminario que el evento fue organizado por la Dirección General de Relaciones Institucionales y por el Centro de Estudios Constitucionales y su directora Ana María Ibarra, siguiendo la visión del ministro presidente Arturo Saldívar. Queremos comentarles también que el profesor nos dará una conferencia por alrededor de 1 hora y después habrá un espacio para preguntas y respuestas de aproximadamente 25 minutos. Les pedimos que durante la sesión nos envíen vía las redes sociales YouTube o Facebook, donde estén sintonizando el evento, nos pongan ahí sus preguntas y se las haremos llegar al final y responderá el mayor número de preguntas o posteriormente por correo electrónico. Pues sin mayor preámbulo, le agradezco al profesor y es un honor para nosotros que nos acompañe y damos paso a su conferencia.
Thank you for that introduction and for inviting me to give this talk on progressive constitutionalism. I will talk for a while and then we'll see if there are questions that I might be able to address either in this session or via email afterwards. I decided to divide this talk into two parts. The first, or to identify progressive constitutionalism with two ways of thinking about constitutions. Roughly speaking, they are substantive ways of thinking and procedural ways of thinking. So I'm going to begin with the substantive ideas about progressive constitutionalism, probably because those are more likely to be familiar to you and more fit together with other ways of thinking about constitutions. The idea of progressive constitutionalism as a substantive matter is that progressivism at any point in time has some particular policy orientation. So, for example, progressivism in the, say, 19th century meant expanding the franchise to include previously excluded people. And then progressivism in the 20th century came to include some ideas about constitutionally guaranteed social and economic welfare rights, including rights to housing, rights to food, rights to shelter, in some modern constitutions, rights to potable water, and the like. And then in the 21st century, progressive constitutionalism has again expanded to include notions about rights either in or of the environment and rights of people in their communities and associations other than, as had traditionally been the case, rights with respect to religious associations, trade unions, and families. So in particular, rights of preservation of communal autonomy. Now, there are, the first thing to observe here is something I've already introduced, which is that progressive constitutionalism in its substantive guise doesn't have fixed content. It's progressive relative to the time and place where that form of constitutionalism is being advocated and or implemented. And so it's not, it's possible and accurate to say that 18th and 19th century classical liberals were for their times advocates of progressive constitutionalism, but that people who limit constitutionalism today to expansion of the franchise, for example, are not advocating for progressive constitutionalism today. Okay. Now, taking that historical and geographic specificity as a given, I don't have much to say about the specifics of the content of contemporary progressive constitutionalism. I've enumerated the sort of broad outlines of what most people would today regard as progressive constitutionalism. And although I have my views about some of these particular items, I don't want to go into the details of what, for example, a constitutional right in the environment might be. Partly that's because I actually am not conversant with the literature and scholarship on the full range of issues associated with the right to the environment. But it's also because, again, of the historical specificity of the idea of progressive constitutionalism. What would be a progressive constitutionalist view of the environment in the contemporary United States, something like what gets labeled the Green New Deal in the United States, might be entirely inappropriate for a commitment to a right to an environment in, let's say, Amazonia in Brazil. And I certainly am not familiar enough with the local specifics to be able to say anything useful about the content of particular local versions of modern progressive rights. Some of that hesitancy is captured in the conventional formulations about social and economic rights. So the conventional formulations typically say something like people have these rights within available resources. And so the right that you would have to shelter in a relatively well-to-do nation with more available resources would be more substantial than the right you would have to, again, a right to shelter in a nation with a less well-to-do nation, because the available resources would be different. Okay, having identified the content of sort of substantive progressive constitutionalism, I want to move to two different points. These are not really related. Well, they may be related at some deep level, but I'm not sure I'm going to want to explore their connection. Just treat them as separate. The first is that as I've defined it, progressive constitutionalism is necessarily committed to substantive policies. It is not in any way merely, at least in the contemporary world, it is not merely formal. That is, the guarantees of social and economic rights, or the guarantees in or of the environment, are things that have to be realized materially in the society. It's not enough to say there is a formal right to shelter when nothing happens with respect to it. That, I want to note, contrasts with some of the classical liberal, for their time, progressive views about, most obviously, enfranchisement, the right to vote. 18th and 19th century progressives who favored the right to vote meant that everybody should have the opportunity to vote, but not that everybody, in some sense, had to vote. Or at least it wasn't a necessary part of the program of 19th century progressive liberalism that people would actually exercise their right to vote. And obstacles to the right to vote might come from a variety of places, including the private economy. That is, if people didn't have the resources to devote to learning about voting, learning about the issues, and so chose not to vote, that was a matter of indifference in the classical, again, progressive liberal position. Today, if you lack shelter, that is a material deprivation of the right, no matter what the source of the deprivation is. So, for example, if you have a constitutional right to shelter, it doesn't matter that the reason that you lack shelter is that your job pays so little that you're unable to afford the rent charged on the in the private market. Again, these modern requirements are things to be realized materially. And the language of of a material constitution is closely tied to the emergence of this modern notion of progressive, or the modern version of progressive constitutionalism. Now, one of the concerns about material constitutions goes back to the early 20th century. I associate it with constitutional theorizing in Weimar Germany, but I'm sure that there are discussions of it elsewhere that I'm not familiar with just one footnote on this. The reason for these discussions in Germany was that the Weimar Constitution did have commitments to material well-being, social and economic rights. But as you know, the Mexican Constitution preceding the Weimar Constitution also had such commitments. And so, again, although I'm unfamiliar with the discussions, I'm reasonably confident that discussions paralleling the ones that occurred in Weimar Germany also occurred in connection with the Mexican Constitution. So what were those discussions about, and what are their contemporary resonances? Well, go back to my example of the right to shelter. You are deprived of a right to shelter if you are unable to acquire the resources through employment to pay market-based rents for housing. That's a simplified version, but you can see the point. In order to realize the right to shelter, the government must, in some ways, intervene fairly broadly, or at least more openly, in the private market than it had been doing in sort of 19th century images of what government should do. It has to accumulate the resources to build public housing, or it has to impose regulations limiting the rents that can be charged on the private market for housing, or it has to tax basically those who own housing to support the provision of housing to those who don't own housing. Now, two things about that form of government, call it intervention. The first is that much constitutional theorizing over the course of the 19th century took as its organizing principle a concern that constitutions were required to limit the possibility of abuses of government power. So the conceptualization of constitutions was that they were documents that limited the government. But progressive constitutionalism in the 20th and 21st century began to treat constitutions as documents that empowered governments. Now, my own view, incidentally, is that that empowerment dimension was always a component of constitutionalism, but so in the U.S. founding, there was a lot of discussion of ensuring that the new national government would be sufficiently energetic, would be able to do the things that the people of the country wanted it to do. Nonetheless, the theorizing about constitutions was that they were mostly documents about limitation. So the modern version of progressive constitutionalism that treats constitutions as documents of empowerment creates, at the very least, a tension within the theory of constitutionalism. Somehow, the empowerment of government that comes through its commitment to material outcomes. Somehow that commitment to empowerment must be reconciled with the older ideas of constitutions as documents of limitation. I think there's my personal view is that discussions of these issues have been unfortunately sort of separated. So there are advocates of material constitutions who ignore the concerns about governments of constitutions as documents of limitation. And there are people who are focused on constitutions as documents of limitation who, for that reason, oppose constitutions of material empowerment. And that seems to me inadequate. We need some modern theorization that would combine in some coherent theoretical framework limitation and empowerment. The most that there is, in my view, I could be taking an overly jaundiced view of this, are ideas about proportionality. That is, in this version, the government can seek to achieve material outcomes unless the means they choose for doing so are disproportionate according to the standard model of proportionality review. I myself don't find that terribly helpful, but I think that's where the discussion is. Now that leads to, so my first point about the modern substantive constitution is that we need to come up with a theorization of constitutionalism that combines limitation and empowerment. My second point is, I think, as I said earlier, related on a deep level to that one, but can be treated independently. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, as people thought of constitutions as documents of limitation, they became comfortable with, indeed deeply committed to the idea that the courts were the places to enforce constitutions as documents of limitation. Okay, so we have an idea now deeply embedded in our thinking about constitutionalism that if something is in the Constitution, it should be enforced by the courts unless there's some special reason for not doing so. Now, I put that latter qualification in because virtually all national constitutional systems have some idea that's captured in the US doctrine of the political questions doctrine. That is, that there are some constitutional issues that are not appropriate for judicial resolution, but they are conceptually unusual in the larger universe of constitutional thinking. Indeed, in the US, the political questions doctrine has narrowed quite substantially over time. and there are some nations where the courts have, for all practical purposes, eliminated or asserted sort of jurisdiction over every constitutional question. So our presumption today is that if it's in the Constitution, it is to be enforced judicially. Now, that makes sense. It's easy, in some sense, conceptually easy, with respect to constitutions as documents of limitation. Because if the government does something that reaches a limitation, the judicial remedy, again, conceptually, maybe not practically, but conceptually, is easy. The remedy is to say, stop doing that. You're not, your power is limited. You can't do what you're trying to do. Writs of habeas corpus are sort of the most obvious example. You've detained somebody in a manner inconsistent with the Constitution. The writ of habeas corpus says, let them go. And that model is generalizable with respect to essentially everything in a constitution of limitation. But now think about what it means to say that the government has not adequately enforced or has breached the right to shelter. What does that mean? It means that, again, thinking of the Constitution as a document of empowerment, it means that the government has not done enough to provide shelter. It hasn't raised taxes enough to create a program of financial assistance to people who can't afford housing. Or it hasn't created a public housing system that is adequate to provide shelter to all those in need, or something like that. Some other failure to exercise power. Again, in a constitution of empowerment, a right is violated when the government doesn't exercise the power it has to protect the right. So now think about judicial remedies under those circumstances. And again, think about the within available resources formulation. It's one thing for a court to say, I have in front of me a person, a homeless person, who lacks shelter. I will order the government to find a place for this person. Okay, that's a way of remedying the deprivation. But in the real world, there are many, many such people. And it's not going to be, the courts are not going to be effective in guaranteeing the right to shelter by disposing of cases one by one. Or if they are going to create some very strange pathologies. The general version of the pathology is easy. They will provide remedies to those people who happen to have the resources to be able to get into court to demand the individualized remedy. Again, find an apartment for me and my family. But there will be many people who don't have those resources. Or alternatively, if lots of people have those resources, the courts will find themselves issuing way too many individual orders. We know this from experience in several countries about what are known as right to medication cases. These are cases in which there's a constitutional guarantee of a right to health, or in some versions, a right to life. People come to the courts and say, there is this life-saving medication that's available, but I can't afford it. Or it's available, but the national health system has not included it in its list of subsidized medications. If I don't get this medication, I'm going to die. Courts have been responsive to those claims to the point where, in some places, these right to medication cases overwhelm the public health system. I can't reproduce the number exactly, but there is one reasonably well-known case in Brazil in which I believe it was cancer alleviating medication it did exist. It was experimental. It existed. It was extremely expensive. And the form of cancer that it treated was reasonably common. And so when courts ordered that this medication be made available, it consumed something like 2/3 of the state government's public health budget, leaving a trivial amount for all the other extremely important public health activities that the agency had to do. So if you have a judicially enforceable right to medication or shelter, the ordinary method, the method of directing the government to do something, is no longer terribly effective. You have to figure out some other remedial device. Now, as these cases, as constitutional courts have confronted these cases in numerous jurisdictions, at first, their response was, we can't figure out how we can provide a remedy, and therefore we're not going to enforce the rights. We're going to treat them as non-justiciable. Virtually every court, not all, but almost all courts have now abandoned that position. And they say we have to figure out some way to provide effective remedies in ways that are different from merely directing the government to do something, merely directing the government to provide the shelter or the medications. Two models of judicial enforcement have developed. One is what I've and others have characterized as planning remedies. So instead of saying you must provide shelter to this person, or you must provide this particular medication to this person or this class of people, the courts say to the government, you have to develop a plan that over the next period, 3 years, 5 years, has a realistic possibility of actually providing the material benefits that the Constitution requires. Now, these planning remedies have been popular and to some extent successful. What they do require is a certain kind of more or less constant monitoring to make sure that the planning process is going ahead, and that the plans, once they're developed, are being implemented, and that when implemented, they actually provide the constitutional rights. So you get a more sort of intrusive, interactive process between the courts and the government ministries than some courts are comfortable with. And in the end, it's not uncommon for the government to say, after this 5-year period, we've really tried hard and you've been monitoring us and you see that we really are trying in good faith, but we've reached our limit. We can't do anything more. And then the courts have two paths. One is to say, okay, you've done what you can. We're going to say the Constitution is satisfied. Or the other, and this is also not uncommon, is to say, okay, the planning remedy accomplished something, but it didn't achieve the material outcomes. And now we are ordering that you provide shelter or these medications on pain of the kinds of things that we do with coercive orders. We will hold you in contempt of court if we find out that people aren't getting the medication. That's actually happened in Brazil on 1 or 2 occasions. Contempt findings have been entered. That's pretty extreme, and I don't think we know now how far courts are willing to go. So they're the planning remedies. The other remedies that courts have developed are, I think, quite interesting, and they're only in their formative stages, so we don't know much about them, but they're, I think, quite promising. These go under the heading of engagement remedies. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has actually developed engagement remedies in environmental and indigenous rights contexts. The South African court has done engagement remedies in the housing context. What engagement remedies are directives from the courts to say, look, you're the government, you've got this ministry, and you've got these bureaucrats, and there's this community that's being affected by your actions, or affected in ways that deprive them of constitutionally guaranteed rights. You and they should get together to see if you can work out something satisfactory to both sides that will improve the provision of these modern material welfare rights or environmental rights. One thing about these engagement remedies that's worth noting is that they are simultaneously judicial in origin, but participatory in implementation. That is, the affected communities actually participate in the development of the policies that affect them. So again, the bureaucrats from the center, Mexico City or wherever, have to meet with the affected communities and talk about what can be done. As I said, we don't have a great deal of experience with these engagement remedies as a theoretical matter. I personally think that they are quite promising, but we need more knowledge and more experience before we know how they are actually going to work. I should say, we do know that engagement remedies don't always produce the things that the most forceful proponents of modern progressive material constitutions want. That's clear. but they may overall be better than any other mechanisms of providing these material rights. Okay, boy, I've gone on much longer than I expected to on what I thought was going to be the first part of my discussion. So again, the first part has been about progressive constitutionalism as involving substantive rights, social, economic, environmental, cultural, and how those rights fit into notions of constitutionalism, the Constitution of Empowerment, and how the Constitution of Empowerment fits together with notions of the role of the courts. I now want to turn to a second version of progressive constitutionalism, which in its conceptualization ignores the courts. It treats the relevant actor in constitutional development and implementation as the people themselves. The phrase "the people themselves" is the title of a very important work by Larry Kramer in the United States on this version of what he and others call popular constitutionalism, which I am now assimilating to a sort of procedural version of progressive constitutionalism. Here, for the moment, we ignore substance entirely. We say that progressive constitutionalism consists of those visions of the Constitution that are developed by the people themselves, acting through the interaction between social movements and political parties. And that interaction produces legislation that has, in this version, call it quasi-constitutional status. That legislation embodies a vision of what the nation's constitution is. It can also produce constitutional revisions, constitutional amendments, various kinds of constitutional transformations. But I want to stress, because it is what the people themselves want, this version of popular constitutionalism doesn't have doesn't have generalizable substantive content. So if I were doing this more formally, I'd say, well, because I insisted on the historical and geographic specificity of progressive substantive constitutionalism, maybe it doesn't have generalizable content either. I think my notion would be that, yeah, in some sense that's true, but if you look at historical periods, you'll see that substantively progressive constitutionalists were sort of converging on programs of roughly similar character at roughly the same time in many places. That's not necessarily true, and I think it's empirically not true at all, of popular constitutionalism or progressive constitutionalism in its non-judicial version, in its version as political constitutionalism. Now, because this is going to be quite historically, locally specific, there isn't a great deal that can be said about this variant of progressive constitutionalism. But there are two things I think that are worth flagging. Both arise from contemporary concerns about populism and democratic backsliding, as it's been labeled. I want to say at the outset, I think that these concerns are overstated when applied to the theory of procedural progressive constitutionalism, but may be accurate in many particular cases. So what are the concerns? Well, the first is, it's not quite a concern, but it's an observation that leads to a concern. It can't be the case, and defenders of progressive, populist, or proceduralist constitutionalism don't say that, well, we want, as one very interesting recent article puts it, instantaneous governance. Whatever the people happen to want at any particular moment should be what the Constitution requires, actually. Whatever the people want about their Constitution should be what the Constitution requires. I don't think any progressive constitutionalist today in this mode argues in favor of instantaneous democracy. They do say that referendums, consultations with the people, either formally through referendums or informally, are not a bad idea. But they're not going to cover the entire domain of governance, at least not yet. And so we're not saying the people themselves immediately determine what the Constitution means. Rather, they, and I count myself among this group, say there's an interaction between popular movements and political parties, either existing political parties or parties that arise out of or develop in response to the popular movements. And it's out of this interaction that you get legislation, constitutional revisions, constitution amendments, and the like. But the concern then arises that that there's now a possibility of authoritarian takeovers by charismatic leaders of parties who align themselves with the social movements. The standard version is charismatic leadership with authoritarian inclinations. My own view is that charismatic leadership is only one dimension or one form of the concern. The other form is that you can have ambitious politicians who are not themselves charismatic, but who are able to organize a well-organized political party that does have authoritarian tendencies that can align itself with the popular movements. Just to note on this, the example, Latin American examples of the charismatic leader aligning with the popular constitutional vision I think these are highly contestable examples, but Correa in Ecuador and Morales in Bolivia. The contrast of the non-charismatic people are in Europe, the leader of the Polish governing party is a completely bland personality. The founder of the French Populist Party, Le Pen, was not a charismatic person. So the idea of charismatic leadership is, I think, doesn't capture the phenomenon. Okay, so again, the worry is that popular constitutionalism can be hijacked by authoritarian impulses. I think that's a legitimate worry. I don't think it's built into the idea of popular, again, progressive procedural constitutionalism, meaning the articulation of constitutional views by the people in interaction with political leaders, leading to constitutional transformations. The counterexamples are actually, I think the civil rights movement in the United States is exactly what I just described, and didn't produce authoritarian governance. Okay, so I've now described this version and the concern about authoritarian tendencies or possibilities. I said there was a second concern, maybe there's a third. The residual concern is that how can we talk about constitutionalism without talking about the courts? I myself don't think that's a real concern. It may be that for this audience, you're going to think about, judges and constitutionalism almost automatically. I'm not a judge, I'm an academic. I can see constitutionalism outside the courts sort of all the time, and it doesn't bother me that judges wouldn't have any particular role in this version of procedural progressive constitutionalism. The final concern, and I think I will end on this, or substantively, and then I'll just wrap up, is that roughly speaking, the concern is that constitutions are necessarily legal documents, and as legal documents, even in the imagination, even as legal entities, they necessarily have a kind of technical component that is not readily available to the general population. And so if we rely on the general population to generate constitutions, we're going to get flawed constitutions, not because the people have bad ideas, that's the first concern, but because their ideas can't be effectively translated into a workable constitution. Okay, so now what could a person like me say about that? Well, there are, I think, two things. Notice I think in terms of twos. One is that it's not inconsistent with the idea of progressive popular constitutionalism that there be experts, call them elites if you want, who will take what emerges from the popular understanding and reshape it to be technically consistent and implementable. One version of this would be to say, we have an example from Iceland. It's an unusual example in a variety of ways, but in Iceland, there was a constitutional revision process in which the revising body opened itself up to crowdsourcing. It took suggestions from the people on a website, and then as information management people would say, they curated the suggestions. They took them, they looked at them, they saw which ones would work, how they would fit together, and so on, and did the technical work that the ordinary people couldn't do. So one possibility is, yeah, you're going to have this layer of technicality imposed on popular constitutionalism, but it's always going to be constrained by what the people want. If the elites get out of line, the people will say, no, that's not what we were after. The second possibility is, I think, more, I don't know, I was going to say more substantial, but that's not correct, more significant, is that what emerges from progressive popular constitutionalism are broad ideas about what the polity should be doing. Or maybe better, we should think of progressive constitutionalism as consisting of, in this guise, as consisting of two distinct modes of action. One is the specific policy proposal that is, in its sort of easiest presentation, presented in referendums. Now, these referendums are going to be periodic. They're not going to cover everything. And we can actually impose some sort of design limits on what the referendum process should look like. But specific proposals will go through this referendum process. The other part is the generation of general visions of what the polity's aspirations are. And here, I think, you don't have to worry about technical specificity, precision, and the like. I think the way to think of popular constitutionalism in this vein is that it generates the kinds of things get written into constitutional preambles or sometimes postambles. That is, the statements of constitutional aspiration that are taken to animate the remainder of the constitutional order. Now, I myself would say, I once referred to this vision as a thin constitution. There are reasons for suggesting that that's actually not the right term, and actually I should have called it a thick constitution, but doesn't matter. The idea is that you have this animating vision of what the Constitution's about that comes from the people, and then is implemented. And then the question is, how is it implemented? Now, it could be implemented through a judicially enforced constitution, but it also could be implemented through fundamental legislation not involving the participation of the courts. Civil rights laws, general environmental laws, things like that. Courts would be involved maybe in interpreting the statutes as statutes, but wouldn't see themselves as implementing the material constitution that emerges from this popular vision. That's the job for the legislature. I've said I am committed, or I myself think that this latter line of argument, popular progressive constitutionalism, meaning visions of the Constitution emerging from popular movements and their interaction with political parties and discussions, forming the background of values that animates legislation, with courts playing a decidedly secondary role. I myself find that an extremely attractive vision of, again, progressive constitutionalism. So with that, I'll just recapitulate very briefly. I started out by describing progressive constitutionalism in its substantive mode as dealing with constitutions of empowering government rather than limiting government, and discussed some of the difficulties associated with constitutions of empowerment, including the difficulties that arise when we apply our historically grounded notions of the judicial role to the implementation of a constitution of empowerment. And then I turned, I think more briefly than I thought I would, to progressive constitutionalism in its proceduralist mode as emerging from the visions articulated by popular political movements interacting with political leadership to generate large-scale background ideas about what legislation in the polity should be doing, and then that vision is mostly a legislated vision, but it's rooted in what I think of as procedural progressive constitutionalism. I hope that these observations have been provocative and perhaps useful, and I hope to be able to interact with you either in person when you view these, or more likely by email with your reactions to it after you have a chance to view and think about these comments. And again, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to further interactions on these issues. Thank you very much.
Bueno, gracias a todos y todas por habernos acompañado en la conferencia. Es momento de preguntas y respuestas. Les agradecemos que nos hayan enviado sus preguntas. Hemos recibido un número muy grande de preguntas, entonces es posible que no se respondan todas, pero el profesor Tushnet generosamente ofreció contestar algunas por correo electrónico, el cual pondremos en la pantalla. Bueno, empiezo leyendo, la primera pregunta se hizo en Facebook por José Garza, y él se refiere a los derechos de la naturaleza y derechos de los animales, que son comunes en nuestras constituciones, en algunas constituciones modernas, y él pregunta si es parte del constitucionalismo moderno o progresista.
Es una pregunta interesante y creo que la respuesta probablemente es que todavía no. Esto quiere decir, los constitucionalismos, incluyendo el progresista, tienen algún tipo de una trayectoria específica de desarrollo, y creo que de esta manera podemos hablar de los derechos de primera de generación, de segunda generación, entre otros, y creo que es claro que el camino del constitucionalismo generalmente, no meramente el progresista, va hacia el reconocimiento de este conjunto moderno de derechos. Mayormente notables son los derechos con respecto al medio ambiente. Yo mismo pienso que esto sí sería parte, probablemente ya sería parte de lo que se consideraría el constitucionalismo liberal de hoy en día, pero no creo que todavía aplique a los derechos de los animales, aunque sí pienso que va a ser probable que suceda primero entre el constitucionalismo progresista, pero luego que me imagino que va a ir ampliándose o generalizándose. Sin embargo, lo más importante es que tenemos que poner atención a esta dependencia histórica.
Gracias. La segunda pregunta es de YouTube, de Jorge Manuel Aguirre, y le pregunta al profesor cómo diferenciar el contenido de un derecho fundamental de los programas sociales de la administración de un gobierno.
Esa también es una muy buena pregunta. Creo que la diferencia no es muy clara, porque cuando nosotros, por lo general, hablamos de los derechos fundamentales, estamos hablando de ellos en un abstracto, diría yo. Hay un derecho fundamental al trato igualitario, también a la libertad de expresión. Estos son derechos fundamentales, pero estos derechos tienen que ser, como a veces lo digo, tienen que llevarse a la práctica de maneras específicas, particulares, y con frecuencia sucede en realidad que lo que describimos como un programa social es una manera de especificar lo que las mayorías ven y lo que significa la igualdad o lo que en realidad significa la libertad de expresión. Hay otra manera, una manera alterna de especificar los derechos. Les acabo de describir la especificación de los derechos a través de una legislación mayoritaria, pero también tenemos otro modo de especificación que se presenta mediante las decisiones o los fallos judiciales. Y me imagino que esta aseveración y la petición de un constitucionalismo progresista es que el dominio de especificación por parte de las Cortes debería ser significativamente menor al dominio de la especificación por parte de las legislaturas. Esto quiere decir que no quiere decir que no tenga un rol, no quiere decir que no tenga un rol, pero los programas sociales, para utilizar sus términos, buscan implementar los derechos fundamentales y esto debe tener una esfera mayor, más grande, a diferencia de la especificación judicial.
Muy bien. La tercera pregunta se hizo por YouTube, Diego Romero. Dice, algunas constituciones han sido consideradas como ejemplos del constitucionalismo transformador. ¿Quién debe tener la última palabra sobre la interpretación y la determinación del contenido y la dirección de la transformación?
También una muy buena pregunta. La idea del constitucionalismo transformativo estaba relacionada, pienso yo, con el proceso de finales del siglo XXI, del siglo XX. Y pienso, al ver esta idea, veo que la gente ha llegado a converger en el pensamiento que nos dice que el constitucionalismo transformativo requiere interacciones repetitivas entre la legislatura y las cortes. Esto quiere decir Y es precisamente porque el constitucionalismo transformativo trata de cambiar a las sociedades de maneras significativas. Por eso se trata de algo transformativo, pero es poco probable que las cortes puedan tener los recursos políticos y materiales propios como para poder obligar o forzar esta transformación. Entonces, lo que tienen que hacer del lado de las cortes es desarrollar maneras de alentar, de promover, de dar incentivos a las ramificaciones y a los poderes políticos para presionar y lograr la transformación. Y hablando de la legislatura, del poder de las legislaturas, del poder legislativo, las legislaturas tienen que desarrollar lo que ya hemos denominado los programas sociales, y que estos van avanzando de manera transformativa y las cortes irán evaluando, y creo que probablemente con cierto grado de deferencia, para saber si este movimiento es transformativo o no. Quisiera yo hacer un punto aquí. Quisiera indicarles la dificultad de la idea del constitucionalismo transformativo. A principios, en la primera parte de este siglo, a finales del siglo XX también, hubo argumentos creíbles que se estaban presentando que decían que si ustedes querían transformar una sociedad, una transformación material, hablando de la igualdad, de la desigualdad, y llevarla a niveles de bienestar. Si lo queríamos hacer, había argumentos creíbles que nos decían que la mejor manera de hacer eso quería decir la implementación de las políticas neoliberales, como les denominamos hoy en día. Y a diferencia, los que proponen en Sudáfrica el constitucionalismo transformativo pensaron que la mejor manera era hacerlo con las políticas sociales, democráticas sociales. El punto de mi ejemplo, lo que quiero señalar es que decir que una constitución sea transformativa deja abierta toda una posibilidad muy amplia de análisis, de discusión para saber cuáles son las políticas en particular que van a promover la transformación, que van a tener un impacto en la transformación. Dado mi interés, soy un poco escéptico sobre esta posibilidad de que las cortes sean capaces o que puedan lograr la identificación de los programas que sí logren ser transformativos y diferenciarlos de los que no lo vayan a hacer. Yo sé que la Corte sudafricana ha sido criticada por no poder haber sido suficientemente agresiva para promover la transformación. Sin embargo, yo pienso que estas críticas probablemente no tienen un buen fundamento.
Muchas gracias. La siguiente pregunta se hizo por YouTube. Jorge Manuel Aguirre nos pregunta si una constitución progresista empodera al Estado o fortalece la idea de un Estado prestacional.
Mi inclinación sería, o es decir, que el constitucionalismo progresista probablemente van a decir, los constitucionalistas progresistas van a decir que por los múltiples dominios de las políticas, la implementación de visiones progresistas de la Constitución requerirá de ejercicios de poder del Estado. Sin embargo, yo diría, a nivel analítico, que la noción de que un Estado tenga más o menos poder probablemente es un error. El Estado tiene un Estado progresista y un Estado conservador. Y estos dos tienen poder. El un Estado ejerce su poder a través de los programas adoptados por la legislación y el Estado conservador ejerce su poder estructurando las reglas que regulan al mercado privado. Y así se puede empoderar a los actores del mercado. Pero ambas formas de ejercicio requieren de poder. Hablando de las prestaciones sociales o beneficios sociales, yo invoco al neoliberalismo y esta invocación me dice que no pienso que el progresismo sea necesariamente el que esté en el constitucionalismo progresista y que únicamente nos lleve a un Estado basado en beneficios. Creo que muchos constitucionalismos lo creen, hablando de políticas sanas, lo que nosotros en los Estados Unidos llamamos la seguridad social. Esto es algo que se tiene allá y por consiguiente hay muchos beneficios sociales. Sin embargo, mi posición al respecto me dice que esta es una cuestión de análisis de políticas y yo tengo mis propias opiniones. Sin embargo, no estoy completamente enterado de si está o no comprometido a las ideas de seguridad y de beneficios sociales. No estoy del todo familiarizado.
Bien, la siguiente pregunta es de Luisa Fernanda Cano. Pregunta, ¿en qué medida los remedios de compromiso, en lugar de las órdenes de planeación, pueden dejar desprotegidos los derechos, buscando ser deferentes con los órganos democráticos?
No hay duda de que los remedios de compromiso tienen sus desventajas. Y en particular, si el remedio es meramente de compromiso, entonces el gobierno, la entidad gubernamental, podrá comprometerse con las poblaciones objetivo, pero al final adelantarse o seguir con los planes iniciales, cualesquiera que han sido. Uno de los casos importantes de Sudáfrica toma exactamente esa forma. Entonces, algunos de los casos latinoamericanos en el caso de las comunidades indígenas también han tomado esta forma, los derechos de compromiso. Los gobiernos han dicho, sí, tenemos que comprometernos, ya nos comprometimos, ya tomamos todas estas consideraciones en cuenta y pensamos que nuestro programa sigue siendo un mejor programa. Entonces, los remedios de compromiso sí nos da un cierto tipo de poder, un poder para podernos comprometer y participar en un análisis, en una discusión con las comunidades objetivo, pero no le dan a estas comunidades el poder de veto con respecto a la política. Nosotros luego vamos a tener que pensar si estos remedios de compromiso con ese tipo de limitación, a pesar de todo esto, serían mejores que las órdenes obligatorias o las órdenes de planificación o de planeación, que podrían significar una resistencia burocrática y cosas similares. Y yo pienso que actualmente, mi opinión en este momento es que en este momento sí sabemos lo suficiente para poder saber que las órdenes de planeación o las obligatorias para dar beneficios. Sí, sabemos que tienen algunas desventajas. Todavía no sabemos suficiente o no estamos lo suficientemente familiarizados con respecto a los remedios de compromiso para poder comparar los beneficios y las limitaciones de estos remedios de compromiso, las diferencias entre estos dos mecanismos y, por otro lado, lo que sucede con las órdenes obligatorias. sí conocemos más, estamos más familiarizados con los límites y beneficios de las órdenes, pero todavía no estamos lo suficientemente familiarizados con los derechos, los de los remedios de compromiso.
Gracias. La siguiente pregunta la hace Raúl Ibáñez por YouTube. La pregunta es, el progresismo en América Latina siempre ha tenido una tensión interna por apostar o no por los tribunales. En Estados Unidos creo que pasó algo similar. ¿Usted cree que esta tensión solo puede resolverse atendiendo al contexto de cada país?
¿Cómo lo puedo decir? Históricamente en los Estados Unidos, el constitucionalismo, los constitucionalismos progresistas estuvieron, en toda la historia fueron muy escépticos con respecto a las cortes, a los tribunales, a principios del siglo XX, cuando hubo un movimiento progresista, así se le etiquetó progresista, en su mayoría fue escéptico con respecto a lo que en ese momento podían hacer las cortes y tribunales, cortes de Estados Unidos, pero a finales del siglo XX, por esta experiencia breve, sin embargo, no insignificativa, donde se designó la Corte de Órdenes, estas estuvieron más atraídas, hubo más atracción hacia las cortes por parte de los progresistas, pero hoy en el siglo XXI los progresistas ven que los conservadores han estado en control de las cortes y se están volviendo más escépticos con respecto a las cortes y más entusiastas con respecto a la implementación de los valores constitucionales por parte de las legislaturas. Es una pregunta interesante, pienso yo, con respecto a la medida en la que la Corte basada en órdenes haya experimentado y haya estado presente en la comunidad para que vaya avanzando fuera de los Estados Unidos y cómo ahorita ya tiene una imagen un poco del pasado sobre cómo las cortes en Estados Unidos en realidad funcionan con respecto al progresismo. Lo que yo siento, lo que yo pienso es que hay todavía un legado, un residuo de esta experiencia de las cortes trabajando órdenes y al mismo tiempo debo decir que hay estudios de diversas calidades o características. Una de las más importantes se denomina cómo baja la influencia de la Constitución de los Estados Unidos, la menor influencia de la Constitución de los Estados Unidos. Y pienso que es cierto que por este giro hacia los conservadores en los Estados Unidos, el entusiasmo que vemos entre los progresistas fuera de los Estados Unidos con respecto a la emulación de los Estados Unidos y de sus compromisos previos con respecto a los progresistas y las cortas, esta emulación ha ido en declive. No niego, también les tengo que decir que hay una tensión. Digo en estas respuestas, estoy diciendo que aunque el progresismo y los progresistas piensan que tiene que haber un dominio más grande para la especificación legislativa de los valores fundamentales constitucionales, reservan un rol, un papel, una función a las cortes, aunque es menor. Si vemos la Constitución hace 25, 30 años, y esto significa que la tensión siempre va a existir, siempre va a estar ahí. Qué tan grande sea este rol residual en los programas sociales, si se implementan con respecto a los derechos fundamentales, esto siempre va a estar ahí y podrá ser discutido y analizado.
Muy bien, tenemos tiempo tal vez para una pregunta o dos más. Diego Romero nos pregunta cuál es su opinión sobre los remedios estructurales que ha dictado las Cortes como la Corte Constitucional Colombiana y cuál es esta relación de los remedios estructurales con la separación de poderes.
Dos puntos. Uno, hablando de la separación de poderes, creo que hoy sabemos, en base a nuestra experiencia mundial, que hay ideas disponibles, existentes sobre la separación de poderes y estos remedios estructurales coinciden, convergen. No podemos definir la separación de poderes de tal manera que se diga que un remedio estructural no es congruente con la separación de poder, porque esto requeriría de una legislación judicial o algo así. Podemos definir la separación de poderes de esta manera. Sin embargo, también sabemos que podemos definir la separación de poderes de tal manera que se autorice a los remedios estructurales. El caso más claro es los remedios estructurales en la defensa de la separación de poderes, porque estas son las maneras en las que las cortes que tienen responsabilidades para o hacia la especificación de los derechos, del ejercicio de los derechos fundamentales, tienen la manera de hacerlo con respecto a las disposiciones de una constitución moderna. El segundo tema, relativo a la eficacia de los remedios estructurales, su efectividad. Y aquí creo que la respuesta es mucho más compleja. Pienso que lo único que podemos decir es que hay algunos aspectos de algunos remedios estructurales que sí han sido sumamente efectivos, eficaces, y otros aspectos de sus mismos remedios, otros tipos de remedios estructurales en otros contextos no han sido significativamente eficaces. En Colombia, por ejemplo, hay algunos aspectos de los remedios para las personas desplazadas, por ejemplo. Estos fueron bastante buenos. Los remedios que requerían la compilación de información sobre la base para que se pudiera hacer una política legislativa. Bueno, pues estos remedios estructurales funcionaron bastante bien, pero hay otros aspectos que abarcan los aspectos educativos, funcionaron razonablemente bien. Otros aspectos buenos, pero que no fueron tan eficaces, otros buenos, pero otros no tan buenos. También tenemos el caso de la vivienda. Tenemos una imagen empírica todavía sobre la eficacia de los remedios estructurales. Mi opinión es que deben ser parte de la herramienta de las cortes que tienen que ejercer los derechos fundamentales, y las cortes tienen que ser sumamente cuidadosas al implementar ese tipo de herramientas o esa herramienta en particular, hacer un diseño tomando en cuenta el problema en particular a resolver.
Muy bien, bueno, pues muchísimas gracias, profesor. Infortunadamente hemos llegado al tiempo que se había previsto. Les agradecemos a todos y a todas que nos sintonizaron. No pudimos llegar a terminar todas las preguntas en una muy amplia participación, pero bueno, reiterarles nuestro agradecimiento por sintonizarnos y a usted, profesor, por haber aceptado la invitación. Muchas gracias a todos y hasta luego.